The heavy mahogany doors of the regional bank branch didn't just close, they slammed shut on Arthur Miller's life. After 40 years of coaxing wheat from stubborn soil, Arthur stood before the loan officer, his calloused hands resting on a table that cost more than his annual tractor maintenance. The young man in the crisp suit hadn't even looked at the soil samples. He hadn't looked at the ledger. He only looked at the risk assessment tab on his screen. "I'm sorry, Mr. Miller," he said, not sounding sorry at all. "The land simply doesn't hold the value required for this expansion." But as Arthur turned to leave, the silence in the room began to crack. The air in the office was sterile, smelling faintly of synthetic floor cleaner and the kind of aggressive air conditioning that only exists to keep expensive servers from overheating. Arthur Miller, a man whose skin had been bronzed by decades of relentless prairie sun, felt out of place. He was wearing his Sunday best, a flannel shirt that had been laundered into submission and a pair of trousers that still carried the faintest scent of diesel and dry earth. Across from him, the loan officer, a man named Marcus whose tie was knotted with an efficiency that felt almost hostile, tapped rhythmically on his keyboard. "It's not just about the history, Mr. Miller," Marcus said, his eyes darting across a screen glowing with graphs that had no connection to the reality of planting seasons or rainfall deficits. "It's about liquidity. The market is shifting. We're moving toward a consolidation model, and frankly, small-scale operations like yours are being flagged as liabilities. You're asking for a capital injection to modernize your irrigation, but the collateral, your land, is being re-evaluated under current zoning trends." Arthur leaned forward, his elbows hitting the mahogany surface. He wasn't a man of many words, but he was a man of observation. He had watched the town grow from a handful of general stores and a grain elevator into a sprawl of strip malls and chain pharmacies. He had watched the bank expand, its logo shifting from a simple, friendly crest to a cold, metallic icon that appeared on billboards every 10 miles along the interstate. "My land has fed this county since before the interstate was paved," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble. "That soil is deep, black, and richer than any graph you have on that screen. It has never failed to produce. Why is it a liability now?" Marcus offered a tight, professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was the kind of expression that signaled the end of a conversation rather than an invitation to discuss. "The bank doesn't view land based on what it produces, Mr. Miller. We view it based on what it can be converted to in a portfolio. Currently, your land doesn't fit the high-utility designation required for our new investment packages. We need assets that can be leveraged against volatile market shifts. Your farm is static." Static. The word hung in the air like a taunt. To Arthur, his farm was anything but static. It was a living, breathing entity. It was the place where he had buried his wife, where his children had learned to walk, and where the rhythmic cycle of the seasons dictated the heartbeat of his existence. To the bank, it was just a coordinate on a map that failed to perform the necessary function of generating abstract wealth. He left the bank that afternoon with a hollow feeling in his chest that had nothing to do with money. It was the realization that the world he had spent his life building was being appraised by people who had never walked a single row of his fields. As he pulled his rusted pickup truck out of the parking lot, he noticed a group of surveyors standing near the property line of the adjacent industrial park. They were wearing high-visibility vests and carrying equipment that looked more suited for space exploration than land management. They were the ones mapping the future of this county, and it was clear that Arthur Miller's farm was standing in the way of a much larger, much more profitable blueprint. He didn't realize until he drove past the sheriff's station that he was shaking. It wasn't fear, Arthur Miller didn't do fear. It was a cold, hard anger, the kind that burns through the fatigue of an old man and sharpens his vision. He thought about the legal documents he had tucked away in a fireproof box at home, papers he hadn't looked at in 20 years. They were old deeds, yellowed and brittle, passed down from his grandfather, who had settled the land after the war. There were stories in his family about the original survey, about how the boundaries were set long before the county lines were finalized. He remembered his father telling him that the land was protected by a series of archaic covenants that were written to prevent the local mining companies from encroaching on the water rights. He had always thought those were just old tales, the kind of folklore that farmers shared over coffee at the diner. But sitting in the truck, looking at the encroaching development, he began to wonder if there was more to those stories than just campfire talk. He wasn't going to go down without checking the records. If the bank wanted to treat him like a liability, he would start acting like a man who had nothing left to lose. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a notepad, and started writing down names, not of the people he knew, but of the people who held the titles to the land surrounding his. He had a feeling that the bank's interest in his farm wasn't just about his loan. It was about the entire sector. And if he was going to be pushed out, he was going to find out exactly who was holding the shovel. The drive back to the homestead felt longer than usual. The miles of asphalt that separated the bank's gleaming glass headquarters from the rolling hills of the Miller farm seemed to represent two entirely different dimensions. In one, time was measured in quarterly earnings and market cap fluctuations; in the other, time was measured in the slow, rhythmic turning of the earth and the inevitable decay of organic matter. Arthur pulled his truck up to the farmhouse, the gravel crunching beneath the tires with a sound that felt like a dying breath. He walked into the house, which felt smaller and colder than it had just a few hours ago. He went straight to his study, a room that served more as a repository of history than a place for modern administration. He pushed aside a stack of seed catalogs and opened the bottom drawer of his desk. There it was, the heavy, iron-bound ledger that his grandfather had kept. It was filled with meticulous, handwritten notes regarding soil quality, crop yields, and, most importantly, the original property lines. Arthur began to dig through the files. He wasn't just looking for a deed, he was looking for a narrative. He found it beneath a stack of faded property tax receipts, a series of handwritten legal addendums, drafted in the late 1920s. They were dense with legalese that would make a modern attorney's head spin, referencing land grants and water rights that, according to the county's current digital records, no longer existed. He remembered his grandfather's stories about a perpetual interest clause, a legal ghost that was meant to keep the land in the hands of the family, regardless of how many corporations tried to swallow the region whole. He spent the next 3 hours cross-referencing these documents with the maps he had pulled from the county clerk's office online. The discrepancy became glaringly obvious. The bank, in their aggressive pursuit of consolidation, was relying on a survey completed 10 years ago, a survey that failed to account for the specific mineral and water rights attached to the Miller plot. He realized with a jolt that the bank wasn't just rejecting his loan, they were positioning themselves to seize the land through a process of involuntary conversion. By denying him the capital for irrigation, they were effectively starving the land of its utility, making it easier to declare it derelict and rezone it for the industrial expansion that the surveyors were clearly mapping out. It was a predatory play, wrapped in the respectable language of financial risk management. The next morning, Arthur returned to the bank, but this time he wasn't there as a supplicant. He was there as an investigator. He bypassed the loan officer and requested a meeting with the branch manager, a woman named Evelyn, whose reputation for ruthlessness was well known in the local business community. "Mr. Miller," she said, rising from her desk as he entered. She was sharp-featured and wore a suit that commanded respect. "I believe your business with this branch has concluded. We've already sent out the formal denial notice." Arthur sat down without waiting for an invitation. He pulled the weather documents from his briefcase and laid them on her desk. The contrast between the pristine, high-tech desk and the crumbling, yellowed parchment was jarring. "I'm not here to ask for money, Evelyn. I'm here to discuss the status of my land and its relationship to the holdings your bank is currently acquiring." Evelyn barely glanced at the papers. "This is a bank, not a historical society. Whatever documents you have are clearly superseded by current regulatory standards. We have completed our due diligence." "Did you?" Arthur asked, his voice steady, "because it seems your due diligence forgot to account for the mineral rights lease signed in 1928. Which dictates that any attempt to rezone this land for industrial use triggers an automatic reversion of ownership to the estate of the original titleholder. Which, as of this morning, includes myself and a trust that is currently being litigated." Evelyn stopped tapping her pen. The air in the office suddenly felt very still. She knew that in banking, everything came down to the chain of title. If there was even a shred of validity to a legacy claim, the entire project, the industrial park, the tax breaks, the investment packages, would be tied up in litigation for years. "That's impossible," she said, though her voice lacked its earlier bite. "The property is listed as unrestricted. Check the archives of the county recorder, not just your digital database," Arthur said. You've been so focused on the future that you've ignored the foundation. He watched the flicker of doubt in her eyes. It was a small crack, but in a world built on the illusion of total control, a single crack was all it took to compromise the entire structure. He knew he had her attention now. The bank didn't care about justice or history, but they cared deeply about liability. And he had just introduced the most dangerous variable of all, uncertainty. He stood up, feeling a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in years, he wasn't the small-time farmer fighting a losing battle against the march of progress. He was the owner of the leverage, the one who held the key to the entire operation. He realized that the bank's strength was purely surface level, built on the assumption that no one would bother to look back at the past. But he had. And he was just getting started. The drive back from the bank was a blur of adrenaline. Arthur could still see the flicker of panic behind Evelyn's polished veneer, a look that said, "We have built a skyscraper on quicksand, and someone just found a shovel." It wasn't just about the loan anymore. It was about the legal legitimacy of the entire industrial project the bank was backing. If the 1928 covenant held even the slightest bit of water, every single contract signed for that development, every permit pulled, and every dollar invested was at risk of being frozen by a court order. Arthur knew he needed to move fast. He wasn't a lawyer, but he knew the value of a well-placed truth. He spent the remainder of the afternoon at the county records office, a dusty, quiet place that felt like a tomb for the town's past. He sifted through microfiche and handwritten ledgers, searching for the validation he needed. Hours bled into one another until, under a layer of dust in an obscure file marked Historical Land Grants, he found it, the registered copy of the 1928 mineral rights lease, explicitly stating that no industrial activity could occur without the explicit, notarized permission of the titleholder, a titleholder that had never been properly cleared by any modern bank. He felt a grim satisfaction. The banks had been operating under the assumption that time had erased these obligations, that the old ways of doing things had been rendered obsolete by digital efficiency. They treated land as a commodity to be sliced, diced, and leveraged, completely ignoring the fact that the legal bones of the country were buried deep beneath the surface. While Arthur was uncovering the past, the bank was scrambling to recover. He knew that by tomorrow, an army of expensive corporate lawyers would be descending upon his property, armed with intimidation tactics and threats of litigation. He needed to be one step ahead. He reached out to a local attorney, a woman named Sarah who had spent her career fighting the small, losing battles against corporate encroachment. When she arrived at his farmhouse, she didn't look like a high-powered legal shark, but she had the sharpest mind Arthur had ever encountered. "You realize what you found, don't you?" Sarah asked after reviewing the documents. She was sitting at his kitchen table, her eyes scanning the archaic legal language with a growing sense of disbelief. "This isn't just about your loan, Arthur. This is a poison pill. If this covenant is active, the entire industrial park project is effectively blocked. The bank can't sell that land, they can't develop it, and they certainly can't bundle it into those investment packages they've been selling to their clients." "I don't care about their project," Arthur replied, pouring a cup of black coffee. "I care about my land. I wanted an irrigation loan, and they treated me like I was a beggar at their gate. Now they're going to find out that the beggar owns the gate. They'll come for you, Arthur. Not with shovels, but with paperwork. They'll try to sue, they'll try to tie you up in court for the next 20 years until you either run out of money or run out of time. That's the playbook. They win by attrition. Then let's change the game," Arthur said. "If I make this public, if I show the community that the bank's expansion plans are built on a legal fiction, what happens to their stock? What happens to their reputation?" Sarah's eyes lit up. "If you go public, you aren't just an angry farmer anymore. You're a whistleblower. And in this market, uncertainty is the enemy of profit. If the public starts questioning the bank's stability, if they start wondering if their deposits are being backed by disputed land, that's when you get real power." Arthur looked out the window at his fields, watching the sun dip below the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the wheat. He had spent his whole life working this land, tending to the soil, ensuring that it was healthy and productive. He wasn't a man who enjoyed conflict, but he was a man who understood the value of protection. That night, they drafted a letter. It wasn't addressed to the bank, it was addressed to the state's regulatory body and the local news outlets. It outlined the existence of the covenant and the bank's willful disregard for the historical title, framing it as a case of gross mismanagement and potential fraud. It was a calculated risk, but it was the only way to level the playing field. By the time he went to bed, the silence in the house felt different. It was no longer the heavy silence of despair, but the quiet tension of an impending storm. He knew that tomorrow, the town would be buzzing, and the bank would be in damage control mode. He had taken his first step into a world he didn't belong to, and he knew there was no going back. He didn't sleep much. He lay in bed, listening to the wind rattle the old window frames, thinking about his grandfather and the decision he had made nearly a century ago to protect this family legacy. He wondered if his grandfather had known that one day, this piece of paper would be the only thing standing between his farm and a group of corporate suits who didn't know the difference between a crop and a liability. The answer, he suspected, was yes. The past was never truly dead, it was just waiting for the right moment to make its presence felt. The following morning, the atmosphere in the county was electric. News of the Miller Covenant had leaked, spreading through the local diner gossip chain faster than a prairie fire. By noon, the bank's parking lot was jammed not with tractors, but with local reporters and a few curious investors looking for answers. The bank had issued a curt statement dismissing the claims as baseless historical litigation, but the damage was already done. The uncertainty had hit their share price, and the board of directors, usually composed of people who considered a trip to the county seat a chore, was now demanding answers. Arthur arrived at the bank at 10 a.m., just as he had promised. He didn't come alone. Sarah was by his side, carrying a briefcase filled with copies of the original deeds and the formal complaint they had filed with the State Oversight Board. As they walked through the lobby, the shift in power was palpable. The security guards, who had been stiff and unwelcoming just 48 hours ago, now stepped aside with an almost deferential caution. They knew that Arthur wasn't just a farmer anymore, he was the man holding the detonator. They were ushered into the boardroom, a space that felt like an operating theater, all cold glass and chrome. Evelyn was there, flanked by two corporate attorneys who looked like they'd been manufactured in a lab. They were older, sharper, and carried an aura of practiced arrogance that Arthur found tedious. Mr. Miller, one of the attorneys began, not even bothering with a polite introduction. This charade has cost our client significant market value. You are aware that filing frivolous claims against a financial institution carries serious legal repercussions. We suggest you withdraw your filings immediately. Arthur didn't blink. He pulled a chair out and sat down, his heavy boots making a dull thud against the plush carpet. He looked around the room, taking in the expensive artwork and the panoramic view of the town that the bank was so desperate to conquer. I'm not the one playing games, Arthur said, his voice calm and resonant. I'm here to ensure that the laws governing this land are respected. If you want this to end, you'll drop the foreclosure threats, acknowledge the validity of the historical covenant, and grant the irrigation loan I requested at the original terms. The attorney scoffed, leaning back in his chair. You're an amateur, Miller. You think a century-old piece of paper can stop a multi-billion-dollar development? We have armies of lawyers who do nothing but dismantle claims like yours. We will drown you in procedural motions until you don't even remember why you started this. That may be, Sarah interjected, her voice sharp as a scalpel. But while you're drowning him, you'll also be explaining to the state regulatory board why your internal audit team failed to disclose a registered mineral rights encumbrance. You'll be explaining to your shareholders why the land you've been touting as the cornerstone of your new industrial portfolio is actually legally unbuildable. Is that a conversation you want to have during the next quarterly earnings call? The room went silent. The attorney's smug expression faltered, just for a second. He looked at Evelyn, who was staring fixedly at her tablet. The revelation hadn't just been a threat, it was a reality check. The bank had been so arrogant that they had skipped the most basic step of real estate acquisition, the deep dive title search. They had bet the farm, literally, on the idea that no one would notice. You're bluffing, the attorney said, though his voice lacked the confidence it had held a moment ago. Check the file, counselor, Arthur said, sliding a copy of the original 1928 deed across the table. Page 4, paragraph 3. It's all there. And if you think I'm bluffing, feel free to call the state regulator. I believe they're expecting my call in about 20 minutes. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. For years, the bank had operated on the principle that if you were big enough, the rules were just suggestions. They had treated farmers, small business owners, and the land itself as resources to be extracted and discarded. But Arthur had proven that even in a world of high-speed finance and digital infrastructure, the fundamentals still held weight. Property rights, historical covenants, and the truth, these were the bedrock upon which everything else was built, and they couldn't be erased by a clever marketing campaign. Evelyn finally looked up. She looked tired, the mask of the ruthless executive slipping to reveal the human being beneath. She realized that the cost of fighting this battle, in time, legal fees, and the inevitable public relations disaster, far outweighed the benefit of acquiring one farmer's land. "What do you want, Mr. Miller?" she asked quietly. "I told you," Arthur replied. "I want to modernize my farm. I want the loan I requested, and I want the bank to publicly acknowledge the historical status of the property. And I want the development plans for the surrounding area to be reviewed with the proper legal oversight." It wasn't a total surrender, but it was a retreat. The attorney tried to protest, but Evelyn held up a hand. She knew when the game was up. The agreement was signed 3 days later. It wasn't the kind of deal that made headlines in the national papers, but in the county, it was seismic. The bank provided the loan at a rate that would have made a seasoned financier blush, and more importantly, they issued a formal statement acknowledging the historical significance of the Miller estate. The industrial park project was significantly delayed, forcing the bank to undergo a massive internal audit that uncovered exactly the kind of institutional rot Arthur had suspected. Arthur's farm didn't become a paradise overnight. The irrigation installation was backbreaking work, and the legal shadow of the ordeal still lingered in the form of occasional follow-up letters and regulatory inquiries. But the farm changed in a fundamental way. It was no longer just a patch of soil being squeezed by the pressure of modern development, it had become a symbol of what could happen when a single individual refused to be intimidated by the cold, metallic logic of the new era. The fallout for the bank was severe. The public scrutiny triggered by Arthur's stand led to a deeper investigation by state regulators, revealing a culture of corner-cutting that spanned several counties. The branch manager, Evelyn, was eventually reassigned, and the regional leadership was overhauled. It was a rare, tangible reminder that even the most formidable institutions are only as strong as their integrity, and their due diligence. Arthur often sat on his porch as the sun began to set, looking out over the rows of wheat that stood taller and greener than they had in years. The modern irrigation system hummed in the distance, a steady, rhythmic sound that was the heartbeat of a farm that was now safe for at least another generation. He often thought about the iron-bound ledger that had started it all. It sat on his desk, its yellowed pages a quiet testament to the idea that the past is never truly dead. It is simply a foundation, waiting for the right person to build upon it. He wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He didn't want fame, and he certainly didn't want a seat at the table with the people who had tried to take his land. He was a farmer. He wanted to work his fields, provide for his family, and leave the world a little bit better than he found it. The bank had viewed his land as a static asset, a liability to be cleared for a higher functioning future. But Arthur had proved that static was just another word for steady. In a world obsessed with constant, rapid, and often hollow growth, there was still immense value in the things that were built to last. The town, too, began to change. The farmers who had watched Arthur's struggle from the sidelines started to take a different interest in their own land titles. They started asking questions at the clerk's office. They started looking for their own historical covenants and mineral rights. The culture of blind acceptance that the bank had relied on began to erode, replaced by a cautious, informed sense of ownership. It was a subtle shift, but one that changed the entire power dynamic of the region. As for Arthur, he kept his head down and his hands dirty. He found that the satisfaction of a successful harvest was far more rewarding than the temporary ego boost of a victory in a boardroom. He had learned that the most important things in life aren't found on a digital spreadsheet or a market cap graph. They are found in the soil, in the history of the families who worked it, and in the quiet resolve to defend what is rightfully yours. One afternoon, a young man from the county newspaper stopped by to interview him for a retrospective piece on the Bank Rebellion, as the locals had begun to call it. Looking back, Mr. Miller, the reporter asked, scribbling notes on a pad. Did you ever think you would be the one to bring a major financial institution to its knees? What advice would you give to others who find themselves in a similar situation? Arthur looked out at his fields, his face weathered by the wind and the work. He thought about the young loan officer, the cold mahogany desk, and the arrogance that had almost cost him everything. I didn't bring them to their knees, Arthur said, his voice quiet but firm. They were already on their knees. They just hadn't realized it yet. My advice? Don't let someone else define the value of what you own. If you're a farmer, be a farmer. If you have a legacy, protect it. And never, ever assume that because something is big, it's correct. The most important things in life are often the oldest, the quietest, and the most easily ignored. Don't ignore them. The reporter left, and Arthur went back to his work. The sky was clear, the soil was rich, and for the first time in a long time, the future of the farm felt certain. He wasn't worried about the next quarterly earnings report or the next industrial development plan. He was focused on the next harvest, the next season, and the next sunrise over the land that his grandfather had fought to secure and that he had fought to keep. The story of the bank and the farmer became a local legend, a cautionary tale that would be told for years to come. But to Arthur, it was simply history. It was the story of a man who looked at the ledger of the world, saw the errors in the math, and decided to balance the books himself. In the end, it wasn't about money. It was about the land, the truth, and the enduring power of a legacy that refuses to be bought, sold, or forgotten.